Steve. Good morning, everybody. Still morning out there. So, Chris has been involved with Leave a Legacy for a very long time. He's currently VP and Plan Giving Product Specialist at PNC in the institutional asset management side. He has 27 years of experience in trust, estate, and philanthropic planning in his role. He's a guest speaker for various plan giving councils around the country, a member of the Plan Giving Roundtable, obviously in Southeastern Michigan, and serves on the council board. He is also currently chair of the Mentor Committee. He's a former PPP national board member and served as the chair of the 2013 National Conference in Minneapolis. What most of you don't know is that Chris is a professional opera singer, debuting with the Michigan Opera Theater in Detroit, and has performed with various opera companies and orchestras throughout the United States and Europe, and he will now sing for me.
What Gary didn't mention is that I now use my big mouth for something more important. Thank you, Gary, and thank you all for being here. What we want to chat about today is our boards and how to make sure that our boards and our board members do not become bored or burned out. And joining me today are two very great friends and very, let's say, experts on this situation. You know, if you're going to be on one of these, you always pick out people who know more about it than you do, and that way you look good. And first and foremost is Tom Scholler. As everybody knows, Tom is with the Archdiocese of Detroit. He served on the Plan Giving Council board. He was a past president. I was proud to serve under him, and that proves that Tom knows how to keep unruly board members in line. So there's the first accreditation. He's a member of the State Bar of Michigan, the Catholic Lawyer Society, the American Institute of CPAs, and the Michigan Association of CPAs. He's the past president of the Financial and Estate Planning Council of Metropolitan Detroit. He served on the board of directors of the Western Michigan Estate Planning Council. He's the secretary of the board of directors at Ferris Foundation at Ferris State University. He chaired the audit committee, which is always a lot of fun. And he serves on the board of directors of the Catholic Foundation of Michigan. He's also on our steering committee for Leave a Legacy. So Tom knows it from outside as well as dealing with boards in his role. Next to him, another great friend of mine who agreed to help make me look decent is Matt Friedman, who is the co-founder of Tanner Friedman. And his qualifications for today, not only working with nonprofit organizations to make sure that we all look good, he's the chair of the Children's Hospital of Michigan Foundation Board of Trustees. Other boards that he has served on is Legacy Detroit Medical Center, the Michigan Sports Hall of Fame, the Atuma Foundation for Kids, Charity Motors and the Detroit Regional Chamber Foundation, and he chairs the Detroit Regional Chamber's PR and Marketing Advisory Council. So again, someone who knows how to use a whip and a chair to make sure that the boards are functioning. So let's get into this. One thing that my esteemed colleagues and I wanted to warn you about is it says panel discussion, and we are very willing to discuss and share with you our ideas, but you're involved as well. So the doors will be locked and questions will be posed, but we also want you to ask all of us questions and brainstorm, because that's, I think, what's most important about a session like this. Talking, sharing, and basically interacting on how can we make sure that our boards are very effective, that they feel that they're empowered, not too empowered, but empowered to really make a difference and have an impact on our charitable missions. So that's why we're talking about this. Other things that we would like you to consider is, what are some factors or issues that would cause your board members to feel bored or burned out? Keep that in mind, because we would like to hear your opinions on that. How can we generate a positive environment in our boardrooms so that people feel engaged and feel like they are having an impact on our charitable missions and the governance of our organizations. And another thing to keep in mind is being an ambassador of the organization, and that is, I think, what we all agree is what a board member should feel like they are, an ambassador of our organization. Is that enough, or isn't it enough? So let's get into it. Gentlemen, is there anything that you would like to kick out with?
Lord will kill us if we don't do something.
Oh,
No, I'm looking forward to the questions that are going to come from the floor. I served as, Chris gave quite a list there, on many different boards, some good, some bad, some in progress of going from bad to good, let's hope. So I have experience in a lot of different situations, and so hopefully some of this dialogue will help you folks.
I hope to be able to talk to you from a couple different perspectives. Number one, as Chris mentioned, is a board member of multiple organizations, is a board chair for almost the last 3 years of a large nonprofit, but also as somebody who works with nonprofits as a communications counsel and communications professional. And when I start working with clients, as I have for almost 20 years, and we start talking about audiences, the board is the key audience. And it's amazing to people on boards how much time is spent by staff preparing for the almost Hollywood production that can be a simple board meeting. So we can talk about that too. It's inevitable when you start talking about boards, you start talking about meetings. They go hand in hand. And hopefully we'll be able to get beyond that if possible.
we're in good hands, folks. Okay, first question. And again, I'm going to pose this to the panel first. Gentlemen, weigh in. But also, folks, if you'd like to add your thoughts, please raise your hand and let's do it. Why is the board so crucial to an organization, for-profit or nonprofit, but we'll focus on nonprofit today? Why are they so crucial to what we do?
Well, number one, I think almost goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, and that's governance. Because it bears repeating about the governance role that the board plays, and I think people sign up to be a board because it feels good or it looks good, and they have to be reminded sometimes of the awesome, and I use that term literally, responsibility that a board has for governance of an organization. Number two is, and I think boards are underutilized beyond that. Your board members can be your connections into places you couldn't get to otherwise. And it's about board and staff working together, and about staff not being afraid to ask for help from a board member to be able to accomplish something that would not be accomplished otherwise, or would be much more difficult otherwise. So I look at that as the top two roles of the board, and a lot of times both of those get lost in the dynamic between the staff and the board.
I think the other thing that the board brings to the table, if you will, is a sense of mission. I think the board is that body that has to keep the organization's mission on track and in focus, so that the activities of the organization continue to follow that mission. So I think that is a very important role for the board, and if they're paying attention to that, that will give the organization a good deal of stability.
Excellent. Anything from the floor? Yes.
I already have a couple of questions, so bear with me. I understand about governance. One of the things that I don't think really was mentioned, but I think that you meant this, is that I firmly believe that the board is also a place to ensure that there are adequate resources, money to carry out or to further the mission of the organization. So I was curious to know a little bit about the get or get off kind of theory for board members. And the second question had to do with staff. I once worked with an organization, the board members and the staff were very, very close, almost too close, because it sort of undermined the executive director's responsibility. And so it sort of became, when you mentioned staff, I wondered, do you mean in general, all staff members could go to board meetings, which was happening, staff members who were running to board members. Can you fix this, or what about this, or what about the director? And it sort of became a mess. So when you say staff, I think of maybe just the executive director in that relationship, or I think also about the chief development officer that would be working in partnership. So I wanted something kind of almost.
Actually, let's take the first one, because I think a lot of people came to this session to find out how involved should the board be in fundraising and development, right? Gentlemen, what do we think? As ambassadors, how involved should they be?
Well, I think first and foremost, your board members ought to be contributors to the organization. I think it's pretty difficult to go out and to ask others for funds when your board isn't 100% on board with whatever the organization needs funds for. So I think that's very important. The other point that you raised regarding relations with the staff, that gets into the whole issue of the board's role in oversight or the interference in the day-to-day operations of the organization. You would want to make sure that they're paying attention to the former and avoiding the latter. Now, as far, and a lot, of course, of this depends on the size of the organization too, as to, number one, how large your staff is, and are they in positions of some degree of importance, so it makes some sense for them to have some relations with the board. I know I live in Clarkston, and I know a couple years ago there was a controversy there with the school board that people were supposed to only go to the president of the board and not the other members, and of course that caused a lot of issues on things like transparency. So it's kind of a balancing act as to how much you do that. But the board does have to keep in mind as to what their role is, which essentially is oversight. You raised the point also on the fundraising, which I addressed as to the board's responsibility, but certainly the board members' individual responsibility, if you will. But the other thing is for the board to set policy on how you go about fundraising, as to what kind of programs should be considered on kind of a top level thing, not getting into the day-to-day operation of the fundraising.
I'll answer the question about fundraising first. I firmly believe that every board member should contribute philanthropically to the organization somehow. And sometimes there needs to be a little bit of variability there, because there are people who bring value to organizations intangibly. I'll give you an example. There's one board I'm involved with that's really not a fundraising board. It's really not a fundraising kind of nonprofit, but I provide in-kind services from my company, which comes out of my pocket ultimately. So I'm not writing a check, but I am contributing philanthropically to the organization. And I think it's up to organizations to figure that out with each board member. Just to give a little background on my experience, one of the reasons I got involved with so much so soon is about 15 years ago, boards wanted to get younger. And if nothing else, I was younger. So I did not, and still do not have, the philanthropic capacity that many of my board colleagues do, who are at a different point in their life, if they're in their 70s or their 80s. However, I'll give something, because I need to invest in the mission, as every board member should. At the same time, Chris mentioned burnout. Please don't burn out your board when it comes to fundraising, and specifically I'm talking about galas and golf outings. There's one organization that I've been involved with in a variety of capacities, and it literally has gotten to the point where all the board is being asked to do is hustle foursomes and hustle tables. That is not a meaningful board experience. It takes the board away from the mission. I think it's useful to use board members as a door opener and as connections into the community. But that's a way for them to be bored, B-O-R-E-D, and burned out very quickly. The other thing along the lines of fundraising that can do the same thing is if your development committee meetings are, staff brings lists into the meetings and plops the list down on a piece of paper and says, tell us who you know on this list, and give us 5 names that you can help us schedule meetings, that is not productive. And that will turn off board members in a hurry. If I get a call and says, hey Matt, we're thinking about talking to so-and-so because they haven't engaged with us in a while and I know you have a relationship, would you like to participate in a breakfast? Absolutely. That's a good use of time. So I've seen Hail Marys that can get thrown by development staffs all the time about how to involve board members in fundraising. And my advice is to really think this through. Think of the board member as a customer of yours as well as the potential donor. You asked the question about staff, I use the term very broadly. You know, I divide it up into there are two kinds of people in this equation I'm talking about. There's volunteers and there's staff. The people who donate their time and the people who are paid to work for the organization. That's how I define staff. I think it's healthy for the board chair and the executive director, the CEO, to discuss how board interactions should work, and it really is different depending on different organizations. At the same time, I think it's important for board members to get to know all levels of the staff so that there is a collegial relationship, because you're there for the same mission. At the same time, in worst case scenarios, I have seen where, as an advisor to nonprofits in crisis, I have seen where staff relationships with board members have led to exposure of wrongdoing at worst or dubious behavior at best, and thank goodness there was a relationship there in those cases. So I don't want to categorically discard any type of relationship, other than it's really incumbent upon the executive director or CEO and the board chair to define what those relationships should look like.
And so they should always be professional and productive at all
Yes.
times. If it's in the best interest, sorry, I thought I glued these in, the best interest of the organization, then we should be open to communication. Kind of jumping around in here, you mentioned a give or get policy. Dovetailing into what you both just said, gentlemen, and Matt, I agree with you 100%. I think a lot of times we do hold our board members out there as, you know, talking heads, and we should all do what they're saying and doing. Are give and get policies of some type beneficial to an organization, or are they detrimental to the environment of the board?
Well, my experience on that is I think you don't want to make that such a focus that the board loses its sense of direction as far as the mission is concerned. I think the board has to recognize that funds are important for the organization to carry out its mission, so you do have to spend some time on that. I think and Matt kind of alluded to it on the opportunity of maybe interacting with the development people on the relationship of potential donors. So I think in that sense, the give or get, we've already addressed how important the give is, and I think there is a role for board members in the get, as long as it's done in a professional manner in relationship with the board to the development staff.
I'm not a fan of letter grades and trying to evaluate a board member's value in terms of what they bring to the organization financially, but I am in favor of a pass-fail approach. And so if you can't even write a check for $25 to the organization, then you're not committed to the mission. You're just not. Maybe you should find something else to be involved with, and if you decide to do that, that's okay. Thanks for being here, for the time you were here. But to try to evaluate a board member's worth based on whether or not they hit some sort of arbitrary contribution level, it can be very toxic to the culture of the board, which is something that's really important. Boards where people get along well and respect each other and work well together are a joy for everybody involved. Boards where people hardly know each other because they just sit at 4 meetings a year and listen to reports bring really no value to the board member, and there's no board experience there. And I think there's kind of an old school, new school thing going on here. And I had this discussion a few years ago with a board colleague who was definitely from the old school. And he said the reason why people are going to want to be on this board is because they love the mission. And I said, well, that is maybe the primary reason, but it's not the only reason. Corporations are lean right now. None of us who are in business have as much time as we used to. If we're going to create time to be involved with an organization, there has to be other value added on top of that. And one of the great pieces of value when it works is that collegial board experience where you get to know, like, and trust your fellow board members. And they could be a business referral source for you, or they could be a friend socially because you had this powerful shared experience. And it's up to, I think, board leadership and also staff leadership to help create that experience. And if some sort of fundraising mandate gets in the way of that, that's a real shame.
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
How important do you think diversity is to for boards? And I'm just curious about that, because a lot of times I think there's a perception that it's a bunch of old white guys, and I think in some cases it is. Are you seeing more gender diversity, more race diversity across the community, or is it kind of the same people who've got great titles in business who get on these boards?
Gentlemen, what about diversity on the board? Both gender, race, age. What are we saying? What are we thinking?
Well, I guess I think what we're seeing is that boards are more cognizant of that should be the direction that boards should go. Sometimes it's somewhat difficult, the availability of the available pool of people that you might consider being diverse. But the one thing I think that is very important and people need to reflect on is that people have different perspectives. So the more diverse that your board is, probably the more points of view and opportunities and things of that sort then can be brought to the discussion. So yes, diversity is very important. And you probably are right in that there is that perception that most boards are a bunch of old white guys. And that, not that I personally have anything against old white guys, but that it is important, I think, that we get different perspectives. The keynote speaker addressed some of that when speaking about millennials. I mean, that's another group that brings a lot to the table that could be harnessed.
You have to make a decision, I think, on what's important. So if giving capacity is your top priority, you're not going to have diversity. If representing the community is important, then you have the chance of having diversity. And I encourage you, as I've tried to do as a board chair and also as a board member and consultant, is to look at diversity in as many different ways as you can. So it's not just racial and ethnic and gender diversity, but also a diversity of perspectives and involvement in the mission. So I've looked at a lot of boards where it feels like it's all attorneys and financial people. And they may be of different ages and different races and different genders, but they don't necessarily look at the organization from diverse perspectives. So I think if you're going to commit to diversity, you'll probably have a much better board experience, when I talk about board experience. But you have to think about diversity from as many different perspectives as makes sense for the mission of your organization. In other words, if you want diversity, you're going to have some people who are not going to be able to write big checks. You have to be okay with that.
Exactly, exactly. Also, I think diversity should be because people want to serve. We should be blind to ethnic, gender, age, blind to that, and more focused on why do these people want to serve on the board, what do they want to bring to the board, what do they want the board service to give to them, because it should be a two-way street. Let's segue into, Tom?
Yeah, I'd just like to make one other point. One of my board histories, you might say, that Chris did not mention. I was on the board, it's now called the Board of Trustees, it was then the Board of Control at Ferris State University, and that was a political appointment. The governor appoints the boards of most of the state universities. And the board, when I joined, was halfway decent, but it quite frankly became a lot better the more diverse that we became. We had people of different races, and also we had both men and women on the board, and that really, the board experience, and I think we accomplished a lot more the more diverse we were.
While we're on this, I'm sorry, yes.
I want to talk a little bit about the governance role of the board. Across the sector, I think we've had very poorly prepared individuals that are making the most important decisions around our organizations. And I wondered if there's you know, as far as, I know when I became president of AFP for the local chapter, I went to a 2-day conference that gave me all the background of my roles and responsibilities, and it really prepared me, but I don't think as a sector we do that very well. And there's a real variety of understanding of, among our board members of what their roles are and their ability to deliver as a board member. And I wonder if as a sector, are we looking at that in any way?
Probably, I'll just give you some perspective as a board member first. I really learned about governance when I was a governance chair. I'm not even sure I understood the governance role, and then how would you like to chair the nominating and governance committee? And it was really a nominating committee, and governance was kind of, oh, by the way. And I learned a lot that way. I think, you know, number one is we do need to train new board members and help them understand that, and kind of pass that along in a mentorship way from board member to board member. And the sector overall can help with that. But the other thing I see is there's a lot of organizations that don't really want to be governed. And they'd rather their board members not play that governance role or play it as little as possible. And I talked about the Hollywood productions of the board meetings that I've seen. You know, they want these meetings to be so full of reports and so full of gratification for the staff and the work that they're doing that, quite frankly, they don't leave time for the board to play its governance role. So I think part of this is the administration needs to admit that there is a governance role for the board and embrace that role, because if done well, it will be a healthier, more vibrant, more sustainable organization. And I think that's where the disconnect is more often in the organizations that I've seen.
Great point.
Okay, you segued perfectly to my question. I'm president-elect of the Schoolcraft College Foundation Board, and our board meetings have historically been a lot of rubber stamping of reports. We don't really have relationships much outside of that room. How have some of the most successful boards either of you have been on, first of all, like your philosophy on consent agendas, that's one of the things that we're kind of talking about, so we have more time to talk about the meat of something, and establishing the relationships between those people. What kinds of things have been done maybe that have helped with that?
One of the things on the boards that I have served on that's a big help in getting away from the meetings just being a series of reports is, and the staff obviously has to do this, although to some extent, and that is giving out the reports before the meeting so that all of that business is really the responsibility of the board member to have read those kinds of things. And a lot of that is minutes of board committees, which is another form of governance, and a lot of the activity that a board is responsible for or is actually doing takes place in committees as opposed to the general board meeting. The key there is for the board members to actually read this stuff before the meeting. And some of the bad boards, or at least bad board members that I've been associated with, are people that don't come prepared to the meeting, so they don't make a contribution. So that's, I think, one of the key things is to get the discussion that the board might have to do to get it at the lowest level, and that being committees. And then also to actually read the things that the staff is preparing so that you are prepared to discuss and then make a contribution based on those reports. So I think that's a big help in the governance.
The creation of the agenda is really important, and what you want to have accomplished during the meeting and setting that tone ahead of time is important. But I think to make meetings valuable, a lot of that is based on what happens in between meetings and how much work actually gets done and how much reporting gets done and what happens in committees. And I had a nonprofit client once upon a time where the CEO and I would come up with a great idea, and he'd need to put it in front of the board, and he'd say, okay, we have a board meeting in 3 weeks. I'd wait 3 weeks. And the day after the board meeting, I'd call and say, you know what, we just didn't have time on the agenda, so I'll present at the next meeting, which means we had to wait 3 months to get approval on something. And to me, that's a symptom of an organization that's not doing enough in between meetings and not sticking to its agenda during the meeting. So all of these things are important. It's more art than science, but I think it really takes a commitment from the chair, and it takes a commitment from the leadership of the organization to be able to say, here's how we want to make this time together valuable. The other thing is I was involved in an organization once upon a time, and I came up with a phrase that just came out of my mouth one day, that the meetings were eminently missable. One time I was on an airplane and I couldn't make the meeting and I couldn't call in, and I landed and I never thought about the meeting again until the next time there was a meeting 3 months later. You should want, if somebody has to miss a meeting, you should want them to want to catch up as soon as possible.
Call to inquire where you were or just.
Now, they knew I wasn't gonna be there, and then, when did I see the minutes? In the packet for the next meeting, so that we could approve the minutes as a perfunctory item at the beginning of the agenda. So we have to really pick these things apart and think about them and how they're useful. And I'll go back to this again and again while we're all in this room, is somebody needs to be thinking about what they want the board experience to be. And the board and the organization need together design aspirations for that board experience. And everybody benefits from that when it's deliberate and strategic, but it has to evolve over time.
By the way, that slogan is on T-shirts that are being sold in the lobby.
Allow it.
Chris, I just wanted to add for you as a panelist, it's helpful to me, Sherry, when you served on the board, to know that there are different ways that boards can be governed, because it opens your eyes. You might not realize it. It reminds me of when in the Smurfs movie, Smurfette realizes you could wear a different dress than the one she wore every day, and all of a sudden, your world opens up. So if you're on boards that always meet the same way, and then you're on one that has a different governance model, and you can see how things can be better, that might be something where we could help introduce that idea to our boards to get them to be more like an active board. The best part about being on a board is the interaction.
Mhm.
It's not, here's a thing, vote on it next, here's a thing, vote on it next. It's the interaction. That's what makes the board members miss it and not want to miss the next meeting.
Yep,
To your
absolutely.
point.
One comment, and then we'll get, composition seems to be something that is an undertone in this discussion right now. The composition of the board, the individuals, their qualifications, what they bring, maybe from experiences that they've had on other boards. There was an article in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, August 12, 2013. Want to avoid a bad board experience? Consider saying no. It was a good article, look it up. Bottom line, do we sometimes offer invitations to individuals to frequently, to openly, and not really understand who we're inviting? And if so, whose fault is that?
I'm not sure we want to get into the finger pointing, but I do know from one of the experiences that I had was that there was somebody on the board, an existing board member, when I was being recruited for the board, that sat down with me and had a pretty frank discussion as to what was expected in terms of the mission, the giving piece, the participation on committees, all of those things that gives, and at that point, the person would at least have the information they need to say no if that was their thing, or yes, this is an organization I'd like to be involved in. So I think that's very important. I think the other thing in terms of the recruiting of board members is that some of that actually comes from the existing board members, is who do they need to, say, fill a hole because of expertise? Maybe they're going into some real estate development, and so they would like to know somebody that knows something about construction or those kinds of things, that can add something to the board. Or you certainly are looking to people that maybe have a prior relationship with the organization, have been givers or have volunteered on committees and things of that sort, and have indicated an interest in the organization. So there has to be some thought given to who you're going to recruit. That's kind of the bottom line. And then I think it's very important to tell prospective board members what they're getting into on the front end. And then when they become a board member, then it's also very important that they have a mentor, at least in the early stages, so that they also are then able to make a contribution because they've been given what the mission of the organization is. So it isn't a simple process, and you can run into a bad board if you're not paying attention to who you get on it.
One thing that Tom mentioned I think is worth amplifying, and that is, if you have an opportunity to use your committees as a farm system for the board, that really helps, because that's somebody who automatically, if they're successful on a committee, has a passion for the mission and a commitment to the organization. You know that they work well and have chemistry with other people who are involved in the organization, and they're right there for you. You don't have to go through the hoops that you have to do sometimes to meet somebody from scratch. So some of the most successful board relationships that I've seen develop over the years have come through committees. And certainly also board members who can vouch for somebody and say, yeah, they'd fit in. The one thing I know doesn't work, because when I was governance chair of an organization once upon a time that I talked about, we decided we wanted to get younger as a board, and we had this list in front of us, and I started looking at the list, and I started thinking in my head, and looking at the list, I'm like, I feel like I've seen these names together someplace before. And I went back to my office, and sure enough, it was Crane's 40 under 40 list. Yeah, those people were all younger, and they're all kind of community-involved people, but that doesn't mean that they have a passion for your mission or would fit in your organization. So, as tempting as those things are, kind of cold calling for board members, that doesn't work.
Right. You keep saying the board getting younger, I'm wondering if I need Botox. Irene, did you have?
So being a board member myself, multiple organizations, and managing a couple of boards within a nonprofit that I'm working for, when is the board too big? What is the right size of the board? It's something I'm sitting on governance committees for a couple of them, we would sort of struggle with, and what was your experience in that, and how do you manage the actual size of the group?
Rough question, guys.
Going back, I guess, to my university experience, those were a board of 8. I mean, the state universities, even Michigan State, and Wayne State, that are elected positions, it's a board of 8. So that is, and as far as committees are concerned, I've heard it expressed that a committee of about that size, 6 to 8, tends to be pretty practical. When you get very large, then there is more of this notion of give or get, because we want a large board with resources that can support the organization financially. And so your meetings do become more or less a regurgitation of reports, and we're keeping this philanthropy group, if you will, informed of what's going on in the organization so that they'll continue to be philanthropists. So yeah, it's I can see where managing a large board can be a real challenge, let's say.
To quote the Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart, I don't know how big is too big, but I know it when I see it. There are times when you know the board's too big because you have people who have checked out or are not involved. It's important, I think, to talk to the staff leadership, because they'll tell you, I don't have time to keep up with, there's too many people to meet with, I can't engage with everybody. It's important to listen to that. But some of it depends on what your structure is like. So if there's an executive committee that really handles a lot of the business of the organization, the board can be bigger, because a relatively small executive committee can centralize a lot of the key governance. If you have a really active finance committee that can get a big budget done, that can allow a board to be bigger and have other people involved in different ways. So it really just depends, but I do think it's a critical question that should be asked, is not what's the right number, but what's the right number for us.
Yes.
And a lot of that has sometimes, I was involved with the board once upon a time that everybody thought was too big, and I think with the benefit of hindsight, when I look back at it now, it wasn't that it was too big. It's that maybe 10 people should have been on it. And maybe if it was a different 10 people, we wouldn't have felt like it was too big. We had people who weren't even living in the Detroit area full-time anymore. They were living in Arizona for 10 months of the year, but they wanted to be on the board because when they got a newsletter, they got to see their name on the board. that didn't help us. So of course, we're gonna think the board's too big because we have people who aren't involved. So if it's a healthy, critical evaluation to be able to look at periodically.
I think that's a great point, Matt. I think we constantly, no matter what the size our board is, we need to look at them to see how well they're functioning. If we're not getting votes done because there's too much disruption, and I have sat in meetings like that where everyone's opinion was so important they weren't willing to listen to what others had to say. So it might not be number, it might be back to what I said before, composition might be our biggest ally and our biggest challenge. You had another question?
I was just wondering, do the boards that you've been on try to get information other than just from the top executive staff? Because you're getting a picture that's given to you, but you may not know that the people who are delivering the services have complaints or there's problems. You have board members who actively really want to see how things are run beyond what's been told to you by staff, so to speak. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I've had experience with that. Again, at the university level of board members wanting to, say, tour different programs to get an understanding as to what the organization is doing. So yeah, there's opportunities for that. I think you would want to, out of deference to the administration, is to coordinate that. So I mean, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for one board member to understand this program when it's really something that maybe the entire board should tour and get an understanding of it. So yeah, I think some of that is appropriate, certainly, to get into, you might say, the nuts and bolts of what the organization is doing, just for an understanding and to be better able to be a good board member.
I think some of this comes down to having the right people on your board, people who are engaged and visible in the community, where if there's something they need to know, and because they're enthusiastic about the organization, the community knows that they're involved, they would hear about it, inevitably. But I think what's most important is that there's a really healthy relationship between the executive director or CEO and the board chair. And the executive director or CEO can put their problems on the table and have a professional and thoughtful discussion that's problem-solving oriented, rather than hiding something and hoping it'll go away, and then it takes some sort of whistleblower to call attention to the problem. And some of this comes back to culture, and I see this in organizations of all kinds, but I definitely see it in nonprofits, where asking for help is seen as a sign of weakness rather than a sign of strength. And if the relationship is good enough between the board leadership and the staff leadership, asking for help from board leadership can be a real positive to problem solving in an organization, a big problem or a small problem. And I think I've seen some very strong executive directors and CEOs raise their hand and say, I need help, either with me as their communications counsel or with their board chair or sometimes together. Another thing I wanted to mention, and this may be a good time to do it, is I don't understand the boards who change their chair every year.
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense to me, as somebody who's done this now as a board chair. What happens in that situation is they're just keeping the seat warm, and then 4 meetings later, they move on to the next seat. And they don't actually get to dig into the organization and build that relationship that leads to leadership. And so from a governance perspective, we talk about different governance models. One I'd recommend is taking a look at longer terms for board leadership, or really re-examining term limits.
Mm-hmm.
They have a term to give an opportunity to evaluate if it fits with somebody's life still. But if it continues to fit with somebody's life, why not have them involved and have some continuity? You wouldn't change executive directors every year. Nobody would ever say that that's a good idea. So that's, I think, something to think about, because I think, a board chair, if it's every year, they want to put their stamp on the organization, and they do it in short-term ways rather than long-term ways when they have a longer tenured board member.
Yeah, it is hard to put any kind of impact on an organization as a board member or a chair if you're in a very limited time frame. Sir?
Is there a correlation between how often the board meets, and if they're good or a bad board.
Is there a correlation between the number of meetings and what's that impact on whether a board's effective or not?
That's a good question. I guess on my experience, I'm not sure that it does make a whole lot of difference. I mean, I've been on, a lot depends, I think, in how the organization is able to accomplish what it needs to accomplish. I was on a board that met maybe like every other month, so we were meeting like 6 times during the year. But with the things that were coming onto our plate, we decided that wasn't enough, that we probably, and so we moved it up so that we were probably meeting about 9 times a year, so and that seemed to work better. I've been on other boards where they meet quarterly and they run into some of the same situation that Matt alluded to earlier. If something isn't taken care of at this board meeting, you're waiting 3 months to get it resolved if you don't have an executive committee. So I think, again, it really depends on the composition of the board, what the board needs to accomplish in terms of its governance role. And that's something that you just have to do some reflection on and come to the conclusion as to what works for your organization.
I don't think it's as much about meetings, I think it's about opportunities to work together. And meetings are the kind of easy way of doing that, but there are other opportunities that can be created. One of the boards that I serve on, the board didn't meet for a long time. And there's a part of me that was relieved because it was more time in my schedule to bill clients and make a living. So I'm like, okay, good, we're not meeting for a while, that's good. Well, what I realized is I was disconnected from the organization, other than seeing Facebook posts and opening emails. So if we weren't gonna meet for whatever reason, it would've been nice to get together somehow, or have a conference call somehow, or a couple people get together for lunch with a really short agenda. So I think about how often your board members are given a chance to interact. And some of that, of course, is gonna be meetings, but it doesn't have to be. One of the organizations I'm involved with did a relatively small fundraiser a few weeks ago, and a lot of board members were there, and it was fun. We got to enjoy each other's company and meet each other's spouses, and it was really nice. And that was better than a meeting in terms of board culture.
Sure.
If you have an executive team that's making a decision on something, is it necessary then to take that back to your regular general board meeting and have all of the rest of your people make a decision on the decision that the executive team already made?
So if the executive committee has made a decision, do we take that back to the general board to opine, or does the executive decision hold?
That all depends. They talk about the young attorney when he got out of law school and somebody would ask him a question and he would say 3 words, I don't know. It says as he got more experience, then his 3 words, it all depends. Really, and we really haven't talked about documents, but one of the things is in the bylaws, there should be what the authority of the executive, to be spelled out as to what the authority of the executive committee is. It probably is a good idea particularly if you have long periods of time between full board meetings, where the executive committee is charged with making decisions, is that when they do make a decision, they at least bring it up that this is what we did at the board meeting. And if the full board has a problem with it, then that's their opportunity to challenge it. But it does also come across with what's very important, and that is transparency, so that you don't have the executive committee that really is acting behind closed doors, if you will, so that it's open. But from an operations standpoint, it's just part of the real world that sometimes the executive committee has to act because there's not an opportunity to get the full board involved.
I think it helps to spell it out clearly as much as you can, but give yourself a little bit of flexibility. One of the organizations I'm involved with, we're moving really fast. A lot needed to happen very quickly. The executive committee made a lot of decisions, and a couple of the members of the board who are not in the executive committee said, you know what, you guys are doing a great job, and we agree with everything you've voted on, but we kind of like to know about this and have a voice in this, and that has to be respected too. So what a lot of organizations do that I've seen is Certain approvals are the executive committee, like if an expenditure of a certain dollar level or above, the executive committee has to approve that expenditure, and the full board knows that, and kind of leaves it in the hands of the executive committee to do that. And I think just spelling that out clearly, whatever those things happen to be, can make sense.
Just to add to that, and something that Matt mentioned the word conference call. And with that capability, there's a lot of decisions that can be made by the full board with a conference call. And so that, modern technology has accelerated some of the decision making.
Okay, I know we're out of time, so I'll be quick. A lot of our board is there because of old bylaws. They're there out of obligation rather than mission focus. They see the need for organizational change. They're putting demands on organizational staff, but they're not backing it up with action. We're not seeing any support from our board members as far as resources, as far as connections, even as far as attending our events. They don't come to a lot of them. What's the best way you found to talk to board members, not be condescending, not be like, give or get out, but, hey, you're really not doing your job here, guys, and they're responsible for changing their term limits, which would allow us to replace them, and they're not going to. You know what I mean? Sorry,
a whole new
sorry.
session, your board holding you hostage. What do we think, gentlemen?
Well, for that kind of a board member, then I would say it's the responsibility of the chair to have a sit down and talk with them about what's what. The other nice thing is you alluded to about term limits, is when their term is up, they don't get reappointed. And again, depending on your bylaws and how those are reflected, there might be some hard feelings, but sometimes for the good of the organization. I served on a board some years ago where we did have term limits, and a board member who really wasn't making any contribution and wasn't showing up, his term was up, and he was thanked for his service but wasn't reappointed, which was a good thing because 3 years later he was indicted for some sort of fraud, and that would have been a real embarrassment to the organization. So term limits sometimes can take care of that.
Again, I'm a fan of terms, not term limits, because you have people who should be able to serve as long as they're valuable to the organization. There's a client of mine, a nonprofit client, where I built a relationship with a board chair, and this individual was the board chair, and then they went back on the board for one term, and then they were done. And I was asked to lunch to say, I can't be on this board anymore. Do you know anybody else who's looking for somebody with my skills and experience? That's a shame for everybody involved. That's a negative byproduct of term limits. But if you have terms, and institute terms, and a board chair is committed to terms, a chair and an executive director can sit down with those people personally and say, we have terms for a reason, and we feel like the board needs to take on a new direction. We appreciate everything you've done, and we'd love to have you involved and ask for very specific things. But if you don't have terms at all, then you're gonna find yourself in that situation perpetually. And that's a really tough place to be. I'm not gonna make this sound easy, because it's not easy in any way. But I think some of that is, when I talk about having a chair that's in line with what the staff leadership's objectives are, that's a really good example of it.
I have a question on that, because I think terms are important. Term limits can ruin the continuity of what we're trying to accomplish. If a board member is coming up to what is their term, is it appropriate to interview that particular board member to ask them what he or she feels was their greatest contribution, what they would like to continue doing before we just automatically see if they want to
Yes.
re-up?
That should happen as part of an ongoing nominating and governance process. And at nominating governance committee meetings early in the year, you should look at who's up that year and come up with a strategy of how to address that this year. The same thing goes for asking someone to continue, if you want them to continue.
One of the things we did do that, because
worked really well is we put in a self-evaluation that people do on an annual basis as a board member too. And it's not a score like you're saying, you know, like you said, I like the pass-fail, but it enabled them to put what their greatest contributions have been, but also, do they really feel they want to continue to serve? And why or why not? So it opens that door for them
I
to
think
also
that's-
say, no, thank you.
I think that's important, and terms do this also. I've had a feeling there's a board that I was on, and I had a feeling for a long time that it just wasn't clicking for me anymore. I really enjoyed it, it was great. I've got other things, I've got other priorities, my life is more complex now than it was then, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Without a term, and without any kind of evaluation, I gotta be a jerk at some point, and say, I don't want to do this anymore. And that's a really tough conversation, unnecessarily so, for everybody involved. And anything you can do to ease that, the better.
I think it goes.
Also, on this, by the way, the same token, I'm sorry, Chris, you may have people on your board who are waiting to be asked to get more involved. And at the same time, there's a mechanism in place, if there's a mechanism in place for that, that will reap rewards very quickly.
That's right.
We're getting short of time, but one more question.
Experience with annual board evaluations and then periodic external evaluations from outside companies who come in and take a look at what you're doing?
I haven't had experience with the outside, other than early on in connection with the board, we had a retreat with a facilitator from outside as to help. I mean, we didn't have necessarily a problem, but it was just to help the board to do its job better. I've served on a couple of boards where there's a evaluation of the board generally on do I have a chance to participate in the meetings, so those kinds of things. I think that's very important, so that that information gets compiled and you know whether the board members are you might say are happy with the way things are going, and that's another way of looking at it.
So I did have experience with a consultant when I was on the Children's Hospital of Michigan board, the hospital board, which no longer exists in its form. We acted from a position of strength, and we said, we have a really good board, we want to always have a really good board, so we brought in a consultant who worked with hospital boards all over the country, because hospitals play unique roles in communities, and often need different things on their boards. And we worked with this guy to reimagine, reinvent, reconstitute the board. And I was on that committee, and it was awesome. And then the hospital sold itself to a for-profit company, and we didn't need a board anymore. We knew that was going to happen, or we wouldn't have spent the time. But I recommend it. I mean, if you have somebody who can add value, my advice would be don't just do it when you feel like things are strained. Maybe at a time of strength is a really good time to do it to ensure continuity, sustainability going forward.
I believe our term has just about expired today, but I want to thank both of my colleagues here. And thank all of you for your excellent questions. Hopefully this was beneficial to all of you and that we can continue the conversation. A lot of great articles out online on board planning, succession planning, strategy to make sure that your board is effective at all times. So take a look.